Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Jonathan Fiedler, and I'm the Operations Manager at the Book Industry Study Group. We're very pleased to have Tim Devenport, Executive Director of the International Standard Name Identifier, ISNI, to join us today to give an overview of the standard and how U.S. publishers and others in the publishing supply chain can make use of the standard. Tim has an extensive career in publishing, including working directly for academic and business publishers, and then as an independent business consultant. Since 2011, he has worked with Editor, the UK-based nonprofit organization that administers standards, including Onyx, FEMA, and Editex. And since 2016, he's been the executive director of ISNI, helping to administer the standard worldwide. We are pleased to have Tim to give us an overview of the standard and teach you more about ISNI. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Brian, for the invitation to present today. I really appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Devenport from Editor and the ISNI International Agency. And I'd like to tell you something today about ISNI, the International Standard Name Identifier. Next slide, please.
One sec, it seems to be stuck.
That's all I was going to say anyway, so got it. Thank you. Let's start, if we can, with a quick heads up on what I'd like to cover today, which I can probably summarize as follows. What is ISNI? What's it for? Who's using it? And how might it fit in with your own plans? For those of you newer to ISNI, I'll attempt to lift the veil somewhat on how it all works and who keeps it running, and certainly not just me. The ISNI database is itself a valuable resource, which I'd encourage you to use and perhaps contribute to. From a slightly different perspective, ISNI is often thought of in conjunction with the names of individuals, but we like organizations too. And finally, I'd like to conclude with a few words about how we coexist with other identifiers in the metadata ecosphere. And I'll be more than happy to take questions, probably best at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, a quick reminder of the nature and purpose of ISNI. As many of you probably know, it's an ISO standard for identifying the names of various parties in creative supply chains. ISNI is itself a sibling of other well-known ISO standards like ISBN for books, ISSN for periodicals, ISRC for musical recordings, and so on. ISNI provides a way of identifying public personas, so real names, stage names, pseudonyms, and so on, of various kinds for all sorts of contributors. These ISNI data subjects can include any kind of creative, really, authors, illustrators, publishers, composers, visual artists, and so on, you name it. We'll move on to the next slide, please. To give you a first idea on uptake and usage, ISNI has been around since 2011, and so far just over 14.8 million ISNIs have been assigned. As you can see, assignment to persons and individuals has so far been the primary area of focus, although there's already significant interest in using ISNI to identify organizational entities too. And underpinning all this activity is ISNI's continued growth in membership and presence in many countries around the world. Next slide, please. So what does an ISNI look like? Here are the key features: uniqueness, persistence, standard presentation, and association with a set of carefully selected metadata. The ISNI itself is just a dumb, but of course unique, 16-digit string, including a check digit. Notice the cautionary presentational remark for Onyx users. In this sphere, multiple provenance is pretty common, by which I mean that the same identity may well be reported by many different contributing sources. As an example, we note here the ISNI for Taylor Swift, for which at least 28 separate sources have contributed their own records to substantiate or corroborate the identity. I guess we might call this approach curated crowdsourcing, which actually we'll come back to a little bit later. In contrast, some ISNIs are based on single sources, but with rich supporting metadata. So at the time of writing, only the US Library of Congress had so far contributed information to ISNI about the great blues guitarist, Sonny Boy Williams. Next, please. ISNI is a system, and ISNIs, or the ISNI identifiers themselves, are intended to perform a variety of functions, as we see here. So at a high level, we can discern a number of generic challenges: disambiguation, attribution of works to creators, bridging between multiple schemas, and various kinds of system or data interoperability. And these features are found in many creative spheres or domains. Next slide, please. But moving from the generic to the specific, ISNIs can help practitioners manage a range of real-world tasks, such as those you see here, which hopefully will strike a chord with some of you today. Remember, though, that ISNI addresses only one piece in the wider metadata puzzle. ISNIs deliberately focus on identifying the creative entities and not on the creative works with which they are associated. So to clarify, for example, ISNI holds in its database significant numbers of ISRCs and track names for musical performers and ISBNs and book title data for authors. We use that other work or manifestation related data purely to assist in record matching, disambiguation, and unique identity assignment. But it's not our aim in any way to offer or compete with catalogues, compilations, or registries of works. We find we're quite busy enough with the identity side of the puzzle. Next, please. Of course, like other identifiers, ISNI could fall prey to the single telephone conundrum, not much use on its own. But ISNI positively thrives on openness, wide disclosure, and the public availability of all assigned ISNIs. Put simply, the more people know about them, the more useful they become. And putting ISNI to work in key workflows starts to reveal the power and utility of the standards. Here, I've singled out for particular attention a couple of book publishing workflows, but there are, of course, others. Next, please. So where does ISNI's information come from? As you'll see, this is very much a question of global teamwork, where our membership, and particularly ISNI's registration agencies, act as expert gatekeepers, each in their own domain or area of specialization. The default setting is really that as much of this information as possible is public domain, though we make special provision for cases where the submitting body requests confidentiality and may only be contributing the data, for example, dates of birth, to improve matching confidence. In these cases, where we have an explicit request from the registration agency, we hold those specific data items as confidential. It's worth mentioning also a small but growing number of self-service user portals for the general public to obtain ISNIs. Examples include the portals maintained by the BANQ in Quebec, the British Library, SoundCredit and Soundways in the USA, and others. We place a very high premium on data quality and accuracy, both in terms of the algorithms and other techniques that we use for machine matching and in expert control and scrutiny. The ISNI quality team, staffed by the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, is central to ISNI's operations and controls. Next, please. So now we've covered the nature and purpose of the ISNI standard, we'll take the quickest look at the organizations that sustain it. Here are some of the main elements that you may encounter in your dealings with ISNI. The assignment agency, first of all, think of this perhaps as our outsourced technical and IT partner that maintains the engine of ISNI assignment and the database that we created. Services here are supplied by our colleagues at OCLC in the Netherlands, some of whom may be on today's call, I believe. The quality team are the guardians of ISNI's technical and data standards. They also supply training, guidance, support to members and the general public. As I said earlier, this is a co-production between colleagues from the BNF and the BL. The part of ISNI that I actually represent, the registration authority, is called the ISNI International Agency, and we're authorized and contracted by ISO to manage, promote, and coordinate ISNI's activities worldwide. The consultation groups we'll discuss a little later, and I think by now you're probably getting the message about the importance of our memberships. Next, please. Yes, that all-important membership. Here are some numbers showing the types of organisation involved and our increasing span, both geographically and in terms of specialist domains. I should say in passing, perhaps, that any of our registration agencies can, if they so choose, provide ISNI services to customers in any country. So unlike, for example, ISBNs or ISSNs, ISNI has no arrangements for territorial exclusivity. Next, please. One of the fascinating aspects of working with ISNI is its appeal across a number of different sectors. As you see here, ISNI was rather library-centric during its formative years. But while that library interest has remained strong, others, notably in the music industry and in book publishing, are keen on adopting ISNI or giving serious consideration to doing so. Next, please. I have a strong belief that this continued growth is because ISNI can address important generic needs while remaining flexible enough to incorporate or respond to sector-specific requirements or terminology. Maintaining the balance and relevance of ISNI has led us to establish a number of consultation groups, which are turning out to be great sounding boards, as well as positive hotbeds of new suggestions. As you'll see here, there are already 4 such groups in action. The first 3 are probably the most active right now, but we stand ready to support the other one and other sectors as they come on board. So, for example, we've recently had quite some interest from various members of ISNI in using ISNI in conjunction with copyright declarations. Next, please. When thinking about this talk, I thought it might be useful to say a few words about how you or your organization can interact with ISNI data, which you'll recall we positively encourage. Well, here are what you might call the workhorse methods for interacting with the ISNI resource. And as we say, horses for courses, there may be facilities or information that would be of particular value for you. You'll see here also that there are differentiations between what non-members and members can actually access within the ISNI constellation. Next, please. Alongside the increasing volumes of ISNI assignments that are carried out year on year, the ISNI system itself continues to be developed. There are, of course, already a set of facilities in place for interacting with the database, as shown here, with 2 main APIs, batch load routines, and a web interface. We continue to explore changes or additions to these facilities in response to user requests. 4 such enhancements are mentioned here, and other ideas are in the wings, as it were. Next, please. I mentioned earlier on that ISNIs can also be used to identify the names of organizational entities and not just those of individuals. And indeed, this organization focus was an explicit aim in the original construction of the standard. Quite a number of organizational ISNIs already exist, you may recall from the earlier slide, and interest is growing in other sectors. In music, for instance, there's some interest in assigning ISNIs to music publishers and music labels. In a kind of parallel operation, there's similar discussion going on about the possibility of using ISNIs to differentiate publishers and imprints. And in passing, the names of musical bands or groups or orchestras are denoted as organizational in ISNI terms. So that's another angle on the underlying structure. Next, please. ISNI and other identifiers. We are not alone. or as the disclaimers on advertisements might put it, other identifiers are available. On my lengthy to-do list, one of the more persistent items is to draft a clear and balanced comparison of these and other identifiers that inhabit parts of the same ecosphere. All, of course, are valid and all serve slightly or very different needs. My watchword here is peaceful coexistence. This has taken us some distance down the way in a very useful fashion so far. But otherwise, and pending the completion of my magnum opus, I would stress ISNI's key characteristics. It's open and public. It's not closed and or proprietary. It's persistent. It's created rather than singularly crowdsourced, and it's built to act as a bridging ID between other identifiers. Next, please. Turning to spreading the word. Over past years, I'm afraid that ISNI has sometimes been rather more concerned with doing stuff than actually telling people what we've been doing. More recently, we've deliberately set out to remedy this situation and perceptions, starting with getting a professional communications manager on board who has brought very welcome energy, skills, and expertise to the task. And the results, I'm hoping that some of you will already have seen, because we've seen some big progress across the board via our e-newsletter, ISNI News, comes out 4 times a year, individual news items and press releases, our social media presence, which is now a bit more extensive, although having come off a fairly low base, I must say, and the vigorous operation of our consultation groups. Next, please. I thought I might just jot down some thoughts that you might loop back to after this talk and possibly think about following up on some of these things. These are very much amateur thoughts in this area, but they may be ways in which you can find out more detail about how you could get more involved or better informed. Next slide, please, Jonathan. You've been very patient thus far. I'm conscious that time is at a premium with this presentation and the coffee may be going cold. So I'll stop at this point and hand over to the real experts, yourselves and BSIG, the ISG even. Thanks so much for your attendance and attention today. And here are some contact details in case you'd like to get in touch in future. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you. This is Brian. Maybe we could start with just a few questions that have come in and some others that we've developed along the way. Claire was just asking what registration agencies are in place in the US market.
In the US market so far, there are a number of agencies that cater for musical operations and so on. There are less than I would like, to be perfectly honest, in the book trade per se at the moment. We had some interactions with agencies there previously, but and we maintain quite a lot of contacts with the Library of Congress. I don't know whether there's anybody from LOC actually on board.
I think Caroline is on this call for sure. But,
yeah.
Is it possible to go to the ISNI site and take a look at what registration agencies exist?
Yeah, there are full listings on the site. I'll circulate links after this, both of the full list of registration agencies and also a kind of a sub list which shows you those agencies that maintain a public portal, so you can interact directly with them.
Great. And as you pointed out, this is unusual, not unusual, but it's different from ISBN as an example where there's a national entity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if anybody wants to enter a particular space as an ISNI registration agency, they can do so and compete with whoever may or may not already be in that niche.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Julie's asking a couple of different questions. The first one is, do you have a sense of the number of book publishers or the share of book publishers that are including ISNI data in their outbound ONIX? I know that's an ONIX question more than an ISNI question, but are you kind of tracking it?
Yeah, we're tracking it. Thus far, we've been measuring that kind of thing within national markets more than internationally. In some senses, probably the most advanced in terms of incorporation of ISNIs have been in the UK, in France, and some certain other countries. A number of the major international publishers, some Penguin, Random House, Hachette, Collins, and so on and so forth, are actually involved at the moment, though none of them thus far have actually become registration agencies. They're incorporating ISNIs, which have been, how can I say, assigned or sought out, probably by their library colleagues or archival colleagues in the past.
Yeah. And how about for downstream use? I mean, who's using ISNI data? Is it primarily still library centered, or do you find, and this may differ book versus music, I imagine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the book sphere, still the biggest contributors to ISNI, both in terms of registering and actually using them, are probably in the library community. I think you're spot on there. Though the growing availability of ISNI in Onyx feeds is, of course, driving more interest at any rate, and some adoption within the respective supply chains. Within the music markets, ISNIs are both being assigned and being used, and most recently, and it's again looking at sort of end-to-end supply chain model. ISNIs are increasingly being used by Apple. You might have seen statements about that just before Christmas. They're encouraging all contributors of content to Apple Music to actually include ISNIs. ISNIs are being included in DDEX feeds, where DDEX plays a very pivotal role in the transmission of metadata within the music industry, and so on.
It's kind of like the Onyx of music.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Julie also asked, are there any plans afoot to perhaps syndicate ISNI identifiers to entity-specific Wikipedia pages or other macro uses, or does that have to kind of be driven by the people who are authoring the pages?
At the moment, it's the latter, is the truth on that. I mean, if we could find some supportable and kind of cost-effective way of driving ISNIs, for example, into Wikipedia, that kind of thing, we'd be very open to any such notion. And through a kind of an organic process, users will know that there are quite a number of ISNIs already within Wikipedia, but that has tended to be because the individual creators have chosen to make them available rather than there being a kind of sustained feed, as it were.
Well, maybe that new not so new anymore, but the communications manager will come up with some innovative way to convince the Wikipedia community to.
She's probably onto it while we speak, Brian.
Yeah, right. If I know her right. Rebecca was asking if you could talk a little bit more about the way that ISNI operates as a bridge identifier. She just says, I find myself needing an example or two. So maybe talk about that relationship piece that you started on the slide that was earlier.
Yeah, exactly. I can look at it from almost both ends in a way. In terms of using existing identifiers, so other identifiers which have already been assigned to a particular entity, then that forms quite an important part of our assignment process itself. So typically we would be receiving the name, the full name of the creative, the data subject, if you will, and the request to actually coin an ISNI would be driven by that in conjunction with, on the one hand, creative works with which they've been connected, a book that I wrote, a piece of music that I composed, blah, 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 that kind of thing. But also, if other identifiers are available, if the ISBN of a particular book to which an author wrote all of it or a chapter of it, then that can form part of our actual matching process. So at the beginning of the process, we use other identifiers in that way. Also to disambiguate, if you have a composer with a whole spread of different ISRCs, then you can use that as a way of actually finding out it's the right one that we're talking about. In terms of downstream uses or midstream, I suppose I'd probably better say, other identifiers can actually be used to bridge to identities that are in closed databases at the moment. So I'm thinking, for instance, if we're looking at things like the ISIs and IRNs and various things like this in different spheres where a proprietary or a societal resource exists, which is known and curated, but not available to the general public. Sometimes we can gain the approval of those agencies that we can actually supply our own identifiers and match them, and then crosswalk between the identities that have given rise to these.
And in a parallel way, Kara's asking in the chat if you could talk about the difference between ISNIs and ORCIDs. I mean, is it conceivable that a researcher would have both an ISNI and an ORCID, or is it one or the other?
It's perfectly conceivable that researchers may have both, although I'll readily say that it's most likely that they would have an ORCID. They may have many ORCIDs as well, which is one difficulty down that road, but we very much respect ORCID's position within the researcher market, whereby ORCID assignment, particularly in STEM technologies and that kind of thing, is extremely common. We have a memorandum of understanding already and a joint commitments to interoperability between ourselves and ORCID. We share a namespace, the ISNI namespace, all of these millions and millions and millions of 16-digit numbers. We share with ORCID. We made available a block of numbers so that they both follow the same numbering scheme, but the numbers themselves are not confused one with the other. And we're also working on initiatives for areas either where users would want to use an ISNI to link to another identifier, or various cases, historical scholarship, for instance. ORCIDs are not available for deceased persons. I'm not trying to say that deceased persons is a sort of a market niche or whatever, but that's somewhere where we can help in actually providing identifiers for that group, which is not catered for within the ORCID model.
Yeah, and that's certainly significant for rights and permissions. As an area.
Indeed.
Clark
The only other thing I'd say about it is that the models are quite different. I'm not trying to say better or worse, but the models are quite different in the sense that ISNIs go through the curation stage of whichever registration agency submits the application. So there is a certain amount of practitioner input in terms of verifying the information before it's fed through. ORCIDs, on the other hand, can be obtained on a walk-up basis, and there's no intermediation that I'm aware of between the end user and the central ORCID database.
We're just at about time, but I have a few more questions. Do you have a few minutes to stay with us and maybe tackle those?
Happily, yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. So Clark was asking if ISNI as an organization has developed policies with respect to author name changes as part of a gender transition. Just noting that in some cases, an author may wish to maintain the connection. In other cases, the author may wish to disassociate. Do you have a perspective on that at this point, or is there a policy in place?
We have an evolving perspective on it, I think is the best way of describing it, Brian. Obviously, we in terms of changes in the name itself, or additional names or alternate names, yes, we've been dealing with this situation for many years, and it arises in all sorts of circumstances, whether gender related or not gender related. Can be a performing artist that has a new persona or a new stage name or something like that. So yes, we have policies in place on that, and also guidance on when we would suggest that new ISNIs are actually added and when we should modify an existing ISNI. Long-winded way of saying it. As I think some of you will be aware, we are going through a consultation at the moment on the best way, or the best way that ISNI can react to the various discussions around gender identity and so on. Watch this space for more information about that when that information is verified. I have to say that we've come at this from a number of viewpoints. One of them is the fact that we don't, although we hold at the moment some gender data within ISNI because it has resulted from the input workflows that we have, we don't use the gender identity at the moment in terms of our matching and disambiguation routines, as it simply doesn't touch those routines. So we are having quite a sort of focused look at ourselves in that. And if we use that data, then fine, we should include it. If we don't, then there is a question as to whether we should even include it in the database at all.
And I think we can be helpful when the policy does kind of get sorted out. We can be helpful in the U.S. market, at least in pointing to it and making sure that people are aware that there is guidance available.
We would appreciate that, yeah. And when this is verified and finalized, obviously we will publicize it and link to it on the website and so on.
Thanks. So one question was if you had any thoughts on how ISNI fits within the growing world of APC or article publishing, essentially journal publishing, where author pays or there's a third-party payment.
Yeah.
Or is that more ORCID driven?
A couple of things in microcosm on that that I can think of straight off. In terms of the articles themselves and the relation of the individuals with the articles, then I see that really as a sort of microcosm of the often serials publishing world, not entirely, but probably in terms of the volume of such things. So I would still see there being fairly extensive involvement of ORCID in that space in terms of actually identifying particularly the researchers and authors themselves.
Right.
If we turn to other facets of that, like which funding agency actually supplied the funds for an open access publication, or which part of a university a different particular researcher is associated with, then I see more avenues there for more involvement of ISNI in its organizational guise. Don't know whether that answers your question.
No, I think it's really helpful and I appreciate it. I mean, it just shows the nuance between different sets of options for identifiers like this. Pamela was just asking if ISNI is currently used by international entities that manage like public lending rights. You know, for example, is royalty distribution based on public lending rights? Are you seeing that as a...
We're seeing emergent movements, but quite honestly, not at the moment in terms of live applications. There's no reason why not, but that's the situation at the moment. So I mentioned some others during the talk about, I mentioned, for instance, the fact that applying ISNIs to such things as patents or to copyright and so on is something that we're definitely seeing an upsurge in. But lending rights, not so much.
Great, thanks for that. And two small questions. One is from Adriana asking, she's based in Mexico, and is asking if Mexico doesn't have an attribution agent, a registration agency, how can I get in contact with the discussion group?
Okay, to get in touch with the discussion group, you could get in touch simply by info@isni.org, and I can reroute the request there. Yes, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And then Sarah is just asking if it would be okay for us to share the presentation when we send out the recording afterwards. Is that okay with you?
It's fine with me, and I'll try to include some more content in terms of links to some of the things that I was talking about during the talk.
Okay, I probably have 50 more questions for you, but they're my own. So I'm going to be mindful of your time and first say thank you, and to Jonathan as well for doing this webinar today with us. It's I think it's an emerging area. We've done a lot of work with respect to rights, and we're thinking about it with and deepening our ongoing relationship with the Library of Congress around things like ISNI. So it's timely and fun to spend some time with you talking about it.
I appreciate that. And as I say, I very much appreciated the opportunity to talk with this community, and I'd be more than happy to follow up on any questions on a one-to-one basis as well, if that's appropriate.
Perfect. Thank you. It's always good seeing you, and I'm sure it'll be not too long before we bump into each other again.
I look forward to it, Brian.
Take care.
Thank you.